We haven't covered too many movies set in Maine. Stephen King is one of the only people who ever sets his stories there. But The Iron Giant takes place in that biggest of New England states. Yeah, apparently it's got more land area than Massachusetts. Who knew? I guess we all know now. Now, what does that have to do with our sponsor? Regular listeners know we always start with a coffee promo, so yeah, why am I going on about this whole Maine thing? Well, I like to go on, and on and on and on. Plus, I think what Kent Mansley needs to do is start drinking decaf. Then maybe he won't call in a nuclear strike that will kill everybody in a very wide radius. Well, if Kent was real, and if 1957 Kent was transported to the here and now, he could get the decaf he so clearly needs, or even just half calf, from Sparkplug Coffee. Maine borders 2 Canadian provinces, but they don't need to cross the border to get some of this. That's because Americans can order Sparkplug the same as Canadians can, and citizens of both countries will get their shipments sent within a week. Don't tell Kent that Canadians get free shipping, though, because that might really set him off. But we do get free shipping up here. And what will be sent are the freshest, fairly traded, premium Arabica beans that anybody will find here in Canada. An assortment of blends and roasts can be purchased, including rotating seasonal blends, so engage your summer tongue now that we're just a few days away from August. It's August already? Almost, anyway? What? Well, we record this, not even the middle of July, but still, when we post it, it'll soon be August. Hey, how about setting up a membership in Sparkplug's Autopilot Coffee Club? You can pause or even cancel it anytime if you need to, but members will get perks and deals, and they save dollars on every order. Feel free to customize to get your orders when it suits you. A Coffee of the Month club doesn't let you enjoy that kind of flexibility. Hogarth. Sparkplug.coffee/HYES is the website in question. HYES are the 4 letters you need to type into the right box to save yourself 20% off your next order. All right, well, we can all choose not to be a gun, but most of us don't have those necessary components anyway. We'll discuss that angle and many others right after Bev cues the maestro.
And action! Have you ever seen
The Iron Giant? Hiya, movie chums, and thanks a lot for sparking up the 602nd episode of the Classic Movies podcast known as Have You Ever Seen? We spoil what we review, so don't wig out if you didn't want to find out what happens in this film. I'm the junk dealer who lets an enormous metal alien hide out on his property. How benevolent. Ryan Ellis. And here's the aggressive paranoiac who will do whatever it takes to protect her country, my rah-rah wife, Bev.
That's me.
Bev Mansley. Are you as crazy as him? I don't think so. Nor am I as calm and cool as Dean. The coming attractions trivia for The Iron Giant. A certain legendary rock star has only produced 2 feature films in his entire life. One of them was released 20 years before The Iron Giant came out. So it'll only take a little bit of work to find out who that big rock star was who executive produced Iron Giant. Who is it?
It's Pete Townsend.
Pete Townsend, whose only other big screen production credit was Quadrophenia. So if I told you that, I probably would have given that away.
Not Tommy?
I guess not. He's not listed there.
I totally assumed it was Tommy.
I didn't look that hard.
Well, he did a concept album from the novel that this movie is based on.
Iron Man concept album.
Yeah.
So it was going to be a musical. Originally, that was why he was involved at all. Again, I'm struggling for coming attractions, trivia, and opinion questions, so not much of a discussion to come from that. So, Superman was released 25 years ago by Warner Brothers on August 6th, 1999. You'd also call it E.T. or T2. They put a lot of money into this thing, and yet quality didn't matter because somehow it did not remotely make that money back. It didn't help that it opened against The Sixth Sense. Not that there are movies that compete for the same audience, but still, that movie was a monster. This didn't succeed at all. But Bev, a quarter of a century is a long time ago, so remind us what this cuddly, gun-equipped giant is about, and give us the skinny on the motion picture in question. Who can get as deep as Vin Diesel? Not me.
It's 1957, and an object from outer space crash lands just off the coast of a small town in Maine. The object is a 50-foot-tall robot. He's sophisticated, sentient, and he's hungry. This giant befriends Hogarth, a 9-year-old boy who saves him from electrocuting himself at a power station. When the feds come investigating this strange phenomenon, Hogarth's gotta hide the giant from a paranoid government agent, the U.S. Army, and his mother. But there's only so long you can hide a giant robot. So when the feds do catch him, his self-defenses reveal him to be a terrifying, powerful weapon. So they overreact by ordering a nuke to demolish the entire town. But the Iron Giant doesn't want to be a weapon. He wants to be Superman.
You are what you choose to be.
So he sacrifices himself by intercepting the missile and saving the town. And if you're not crying when that happens, well, then you're the robot.
You told me you cried. I have at this movie, but not this time.
Well, then you're the robot. It's like when we watched Up together, and you remained unmoved.
I have cried at that, but not when we saw it a couple years ago. Or, in a nutshell, the Iron Giant, the cause of and solution to all of Rockwell's problems.
You're not wrong.
He does cause the problem, and then he does fix the problem, too. And you say the military, and yes, they do come with the general, who's a very sane person. John Mahoney voices him. It's not his fault, but then again, he does bring he didn't bring the nuke, but they've got all these weapons ready. So, yes, it's Mansley's fault. He's the one that says, stop the missile, blah, whatever the cue is. But then again, the general does bring the military with him, so it's not entirely Mansley, it's just mostly Mansley.
This is one of those movies where no matter how effective it is and how much you are siding with Hogarth and the Giant, they should destroy him. The villain's kind of right in this movie. He is extremely dangerous, and it didn't take very much for him to accidentally get set off by Hogarth in the scrapyard. He almost kills him. It's just a stroke of luck that he doesn't vaporize him immediately.
Dean literally dives to save him.
Maybe we don't want to find out where this robot came from and what his original purpose was. Just because he got a bump on the head and he doesn't want to choose to live out his original purpose, he's still extremely dangerous. They should destroy him.
Yeah, one that's got the ability that it does have to do the kinds of things it can do, but only because, well, I guess it's one of those movies like E.T. Would he have been as benevolent had he not met a young kid who was so nice to him? Oh, probably. But then look at the T2 situation. The Terminator is taught by the kid, don't kill, in fact, value human life.
And then apparently the Terminator destroys himself, understanding that he's dangerous to them and to their future. The Iron Giant, well, he does destroy himself to save them, but then he starts
that may be part of why he takes the missile to the chest rather than using weapons to blow it up in space, because that's questioned online. Somebody said he's learned he doesn't want to be a gun, even to the point of using himself as a gun to save them all and himself. If he goes into space a little bit and blows it up, he probably could go back to Earth and live with Hogarth, I guess. But maybe there's a part of the robot that knows I need to be blown up. Except at the end of the movie, all the parts are going to Iceland, where I guess the chassis, the head, whatever it was that initiates that stuff to go back together.
The mainframe.
The screw that the general gave to Hogarth, which is, a year later? No, it's months later. It's the spring. The movie's set in the fall, and the end of the movie's at the spring. So all the months have passed, but all the parts are going back to it, so it's going to rebuild itself. The eyes open, it's the last shot of the movie, so maybe we should be worried.
It's going to be a sequel, The Iron Giant 2, The Giant's Revenge.
He died in the midst of love, though. The last thing Hogarth ever says to him is, I love you. That's a great moment, too. The kid does a really good job. Eli Marienthal, he probably should have done more animation voiceover. He was great. Okay, Rotten Tomatoes and such. 96% of critics like this film. 137 fresh reviews, only 6 rotten. Why are there even 6? And 90% of audiences. It's 242nd on the IMDb Top 250. Most of Brad Bird's Rotten Tomatoes numbers, by the way, are outstanding. His worst score on Rotten Tomatoes as a director is Tomorrowland. That's a splat. But his worst for the animated movies he's made, which I think are just 4. This, Incredibles, Ratatouille, and Incredibles 2. The worst one is Incredibles 2, and there's nothing wrong with those numbers. That's how much people have raved about this and Ratatouille and the first Incredibles. This was 79th at the 1999 U.S. box office. The Sixth Sense, I mentioned a few minutes ago, was number 2. The Matrix was number 5, and American Beauty was number 13. That was the Best Picture winner, of course. And we've covered all 3 of those. This was not nominated for any Oscars because the animated feature Oscar was created 2 years later. It probably would have been one of the 3 if there was a candidate for that. Then again, Toy Story 2 would have been 2.
Oh, yeah.
And I bet Tarzan, with all the hype that got, maybe that would have been another one. Anyway, there was no category for it, no nominations. But I was up for the AFI list in one category, the top 100 genres in the animated category. Makes sense, but didn't make the top 10. Well, you've already revealed you love the movie. I'm a fan of it too, quite a big fan, in fact. So let's hear your, not really opening thoughts, but anyway, go ahead.
I love The Iron Giant. Even though it has a lot of things that I generally hate, I'm allergic to kids' movies, and I roll my eyes at this kind of Norman Rockwell version of America.
The kid is precocious.
As a precocious kid, but at least he always acts like a 9-year-old.
Right.
I hate it when precocious kids are smart alecky and act older than their years in a way that I find phony. I honestly think The Iron Giant might be a perfect film. I mean, the plot is well worn. It borrows so heavily from E.T., like you said, but like E.T., man alive, this film packs a massive emotional punch. It's just so effective. It draws you in completely, and I am putty in Brad Bird's hands.
The E.T. connection. The giant is like a kid, like E.T. is through a lot, especially early on when Elliot first meets him. Also a friend, a pet, and then even a father figure in both cases. And then I love you. I think Elliot says I love you to E.T., doesn't he? He must. I forget now. I think he does. And of course, that's the last thing Hogarth says to the giant. T2, the kid teaches the machine not to kill and to actually help humanity. And of course, Superman, partly because of the whole Superman from the comics when Hogarth shows the comics to the giant, but then he says it, his last word of the movie, Superman. That touches me, of course. But also that this movie ends, well, the climax, not the movie ending, but the climax and the giant's not ending, I guess, is in space, which is the end of all those original Superman movies. All four of them ended with the exact same thing, with Superman flying off into space, smiling at the camera, and flying off, which I've always loved so much. I always do a thumbs up at the screen when that happens. But there's 3 influences. There's probably another 5 or 6 on this movie. I don't think that hurts it, but I really was focused on the E.T. connection, which is not a bad thing. But it didn't feel as original because of that. But it is a very good movie for sure. One big thing to suggest, by the way, if somebody wants to watch this and they see that it's on Crave, you have to be Canadian to watch that, right? Crave is only Canadian?
I think so.
Well, anyway, look for it to be the proper aspect ratio, 2:35 to 1. We have the DVD, but I said let's watch it on Crave because it's probably going to look better. And maybe it would have looked better than the old DVD I have, but it wasn't the right aspect ratio. So if you care about that kind of thing, be aware of the fact that it may not be the right aspect ratio. Another comparison, by the way, the same year. They couldn't have been influenced when they came out the same year. But I love October Sky, which should have been called Rocket Boys, by the way. And that is an anagram, by the way. October Sky, Rocket Boys. They're called Rocket Boys in the movie. Anyway, both movies start with Sputnik in space. So they both start in 1957. And Sputnik isn't really a huge part of this film, but it is established that Sputnik is flying around the Earth, which of course motivated America to land on the moon. That was their response basically to Sputnik. And that's when we see the giant flying from wherever the giant came from and landing.
Beautiful opening shot.
And landing in the ocean off the coast of Maine.
It may not be like a plot point to have Sputnik in the film, but it sets the stage for the 1950s Red Scare, the paranoia that drove someone like Kent Mansley, who's our villain, essentially. He's the G-Man who's there to capture the robot and figure out what's going on, and who's paranoid about the Reds getting ahead of them, about any kind of enemy of America. That's why we're reminded of the state of American history, although I'm sure that probably wasn't much of a concern to people who lived in rural Maine.
If there's ever an attack, though, from anywhere in Europe, Maine would be one of the frontline people to get it.
I don't think it's a target.
No, but they're on the coast.
Close to Europe, in the sense I think it's like literally closest to Europe.
Some more useless Maine trivia for you, by the way.
Bring it.
I think Maine is technically the closest state to Africa. That was a trivia question I had for you guys years ago.
Yeah.
Everyone would think it'd be Florida or maybe South or North Carolina, one of those that juts out a little bit. But because Maine juts out further, way up in the north part of the country, it actually technically is closer to the west of Africa than any part of the south of America is to any part of Africa.
We always overestimate how far north we are in North America because our weather would imply that we're further north than Europe, but it's actually the currents that keep Europe and that part of the east side of the Atlantic much warmer than the west side of the Atlantic.
Yeah. Another comparison, by the way, you could make, especially with the opening of the movie, is to John Carpenter's The Thing. The opening of that is the spaceship that lands what is supposed to have been hundreds of millions of years ago, I think it is. And then these guys in the main story find it and everything goes wrong. Well, then again, the thing was found first by the Norwegians, I think it's supposed to be. And that thing is aggressive and hurts and kills people. Now, that thing was going to do that, whether it met a nice kid or not.
It would have torn Hogarth to ribbons. Actually, no, it would have impersonated Hogarth and then torn his mother to ribbons.
Right.
And gone through that town person by person.
Speaking of
everyone in his path.
Hogarth and the mother, let's talk about those for a second. Let's do the cast at this point because I already said Eli Marienthal is excellent as Hogarth, one of the better kid voices in the history of kid voices in animation. He played Stifler's brother in the American Pie movies, so obviously on screen Marienthal was, but hasn't done much since 2004. And his mother, the top billed actor in the whole film, is Jennifer Aniston. This is the first time we've ever covered her. That surprised me.
We never did Office Space? We've never covered Office Space?
Nope. We both loved Wanderlust. We
Yes.
talk about movie recommendations sometimes just off the beaten path. That's a movie we laughed at a lot in the theater than anyone else did, but we're big fans of that one. And she's been in a good mix of comedy and drama in her whole career. And then Harry Connick Jr. does a good job as Dean for that matter, too. We have covered him before. He's Will Smith's buddy in Independence Day.
I think the real standout performance after the kid, though, is Christopher McDonald
Oh, yes.
playing Kent Mansley. Just a whole career of being an excellent heel. He just plays such a good, smarmy villain that you love to hate.
We've covered these movies. Thelma and Louise, Grumpy Old Men, Requiem for a Dream, The Man Who Wasn't There, and also Chris and I did Happy Gilmore on scoring at the movies. So in the 90s, Thelma and Louise, excellent villain. Thelma's husband?
He's Thelma's husband.
Gina Davis' husband, yeah. Gina Davis's husband. Happy Gilmore, we know he's a great villain in that as Shooter McGavin. And even for that matter, in Grumpy Old Men, he's a bad husband to Daryl Hannah. But yes, he's probably the best thing in the whole movie, even more than Marienthal as Kent Mansley. Aniston's very good, too. I wouldn't think of her as a great animation choice for a voice, but she's quite good in that role. And then Connick. But the two main, obviously, the hero, Marienthal, and effectively the villain in McDonald, are well suited against each other. There's a couple of fun sequences. We didn't laugh that much at this. We chuckled here and there. But the whole montage when he's calling Hogarth everything, Tiger, Sport, Chief, well, he's basically just stalking him because he knows when the kid goes out, he's probably going to go to the giant, and I'm going to follow him. But Hogarth doesn't go for a long time and then finally ditches him very smartly when they have that staring contest, too. They're both up all, well, supposedly. Well, actually, no, Hogarth probably was up all night, but he somehow slipped out of his bed using his helmet and pillows to indicate that was his body laying there. He lays down with the helmet on, turns, and somehow, well, I guess it makes sense, actually, that Mansley did fall asleep even just very briefly, and Hogarth just slipped out of there and made sure the helmet stayed where it was. And the reason why he did that was to go to tell Dean to disguise the giant as Art. Because they don't get rid of the giant. He's right there in the barn at Dean's place. But, oh, that's what you saw. Everyone's all worked up. It's nothing. It's just a great big piece of art that Dean created. So that's a pretty good piece of writing by Brad Bird. And his co-writer is who again? Tim McCandless, or McCandless. Based on the book, by the way, Ted Hughes' 1968 novel. So yes, that Ted Hughes, the Sylvia Plath Ted Hughes.
Yeah, he wrote the story.
The Iron Man.
For his children after Sylvia Plath died to kind of help comfort them.
And of course, the last name in this movie for Hogarth and his mom, Annie, is Hughes.
Yes.
I'm not sure it is in the book. It probably isn't in the book, actually.
No, it's probably a tribute to him. Although, as I understand, the movie doesn't bear that much resemblance to the book. Apparently, it's more like Pete Townshend's concept album than it is like the book.
So maybe Townsend was pretty involved in this then.
They changed a lot from that too, and Townsend was quoted as saying, "It's not mine anymore." People were like, "Do you care that they changed it so much?" He's like, "No, I got my money." Something to the effect of, once the check cleared, it wasn't mine anymore.
So the movie does have some fun moments in it, but I didn't love the opening part and the early part of the movie, I guess, when Hogarth's squirrel gets in Dean's pants. It seems like it's the kind of thing that they would have done if they were Looney Tunes, or even maybe the Pixar influence. Of course, Brad Bird came from both Simpsons and Pixar. Or maybe
Pixar hadn't started. Pixar hadn't started at this point.
Maybe he went back to Pixar or went there after this. I forget. Well, he eventually was a Pixar guy because of Incredibles, Ratatouille, and so on. But he was a Simpsons guy, too.
Yeah.
So maybe he was going for goofiness and sight gags because of the influence of that kind of animation. But this movie isn't really about that. When the giant cannonballs into the water, it's not hilarious, but that's a fun moment, especially when Dean is sitting in his chair, and the tidal wave takes him way over, hundreds of feet into the street, basically.
And he keeps his cool.
Still sitting in his chair, which of course would never happen, but that's a fun sequence.
So the squirrel thing, it's very cutesy, and I hate that kind of stuff too, but kids are going to love that kind of thing, and it establishes two things. It teaches us that Hogarth so desperately wants a pet that he's going to have this inappropriate animal and try to tame it just so that he can have a friend, because he's lonely and he loves pets.
He has no friends, too. At the end of the movie he does, but through most of the story he does not.
And it shows us that Dean is not just a good guy, but a great guy.
We'll cover for him.
He's cool, he's different, he's not like everybody else. He says he believes the fisherman who saw the thing come out of the sky, which is the giant. He's telling everybody what he saw, no one believes him. And he says he believes him. But the squirrel up his pants, it's this goofy moment that I'm sure plenty of people did find charming, even if you and I didn't love it.
Yeah.
It shows that he is Hogarth's friend. He shows this is somebody Hogarth can trust. So it's not just a silly moment in the film. It does really serve the plot.
That's true. Well, that's good writing in that sense, then. That's right. One of the better touches in this movie, of course, too, is the safety video they watch.
Duck and cover.
In case they ever get bombed by a nuke. Yeah, sit under your desk. You'll be fine. That's what they were taught back in those days, and I guess they believed it because they would do those drills. I like at the end, though, when the nuke is being sent, Dean says to Annie, there's no point trying to go anywhere. It won't make a difference. It won't matter.
Somebody says, we should duck and cover, and they're like, you idiot, that's not going to do anything.
I think Mansley says that, but the general says that's not going to make any difference.
Yeah, that's BS. It's not going to save anyone. Apparently, duck and cover can save you under very specific circumstances.
Well, yes, missiles or bombs, but not nuclear missiles.
No, yes, nuclear missiles. The idea is if you're outside of the blast that would kill you instantly or burn you or whatever, if you're in the fallout zone, if you're on the first floor of a 10-story building, you'll be fine.
Fine?
Yeah, because the fallout has to go through so many stories before it gets to you. It's gravity.
But then you never can go outside again.
Well, eventually the fallout will... I mean, people live in Hiroshima now. Eventually, you can go outside again. I'm not sure exactly how it works. But anyways, I don't know why I'm defending Duck and Cover. It was obviously propaganda meant to soothe people's fears because they knew people were starting to panic. I love that sequence too. I think it's very funny. I think it's a nice bit of criticism. It's a little subversive criticism of the government who's lying to Americans and implying that they're safer than they are, while the military, as we know, and the G-Man, you know, I forget exactly what his job is as an agent, but Kent Mansley, I keep calling him a G-Man, he's the government guy. They know that they are actually in real danger, but they're lying to the public. One of the things that makes this movie stand out from other movies of the time that were Pixar, that were Disney, that were cutesy, that were gentle, that were very, very kid-friendly, but you have something like Duck and Cover. Are you alienating a certain age group of sensitive kids? Is this a more grown-up animated film than your average Disney film?
That may be why it failed too.
The reason it failed, everybody says, is because even though they had a great movie, the test screenings were out of this world, and everybody who saw it saw what we saw, which is an excellent film, a really wonderful story. But the film that they had released before, King Arthur something?
Warner Brothers, you mean?
Yeah, Warner Brothers released a feature animated film before that failed, and they were like, you know what, forget it, we can't compete with Disney. Why would we sink any more money into this with advertising? Oh. Let's cut our losses. And they did a really terrible marketing campaign, and it was in and out of theaters before anybody had a chance to see it. Word of mouth gave it a good life on home media, and I think it's certainly considered a cult classic now. Isn't it a huge part of Ready Player One?
I guess so. Well, yeah, I think the giant's a bad guy in the Spielberg movie of Ready Player One. I think I saw trivia about that reading for this.
But I think it's safe to say there's still a generation of kids that grew up watching this on home media.
Well, also, the release of it in August is not good. August is thought of as a dumping ground. It isn't always. You used to think that about February, and then something like Deadpool comes out, and also, not Twilight, the 50 Shades movies, aiming for Valentine's Day for one thing in both cases, and they were giant hits. Mm-hmm. So you can't just say it's always about when it got released. That's a bad time to get released. But it probably didn't help this film. Well, the person we haven't talked about much who does a great voice in this, even though I've referred to him a few times trying to do his voice, Vin Diesel. The year before this, he was in Saving Private Ryan. Then he started becoming a bit of a star. I forget when Boiler Room was. It might have been the next year as well.
Triple X.
Right, in the Fast movies. The first one was in 2001, and of course he's been a name for all these years since. He's a great voice in the Guardians, Avengers films, of course, as Groot, too. He even does the young Groot, apparently. They just electronically raised the voice. Even when he's the baby Groot, it was still Vin Diesel doing that. It's interesting that this character, the Iron Giant, learns, and pretty quickly, too, because the movie's set over, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 days. It's not that long. He learns rock, tree, no following. That's, of course, a callback, too. Hogarth is going to go home, no following. That touches me as well at the end.
Oh, I know.
I go, you stay. E.T. reference with that, maybe, but then also, no following. And, of course, Hogarth can't follow him, and the Giant probably knows that, but that's a great touch.
My heart.
If the Iron Giant knew what I love you meant, he'd probably say it. Hogarth says that as the Giant, I think, is already blasted off or something, or is about to, but he'd probably say it back. You know, he feels it back, just like E.T. would if he knew what that concept even meant. Or, I know now why you cry, but it's something I can never do. And Superman doesn't say it about Lois, but you know he's in love with her at the end of that. That's why he goes back in time to save her at the end of that first film. But the Giant, of course, eats metal, like you say in your description of the film. Biting the railroad tracks is a scene that's pretty funny. He ends up derailing the train, and that's another setup because he gets smashed by the train. I wonder how many people were hurt or died in that comedy sequence. But the Giant rebuilds itself. The hand is in the house for a little while. Another comic touch I didn't love exactly, but probably for the kids. But it also does set up at the end that this thing will rebuild itself.
Yeah, it's important for us to see how he reacts to that.
What do you think of Vin Diesel doing the voice? Because you could cast a lot of people with deep voices. You could also just digitally make anybody's voice deeper. But him doing this, you couldn't ask for much better casting.
Vin Diesel's an actor who has never impressed me in anything I've seen him in. Mm-hmm. But his voice work in this movie and as Groot, which is a very similar job, he probably got cast as Groot because of the Iron Giant.
He says more than this. More different things anyway.
Yeah, but it's like a deep, commanding voice that can convey a lot of feeling in a single word. That's literally Groot. But it's outstanding. His physicality is such a part of what makes him great for one part or another because he's a big guy and he seems like a bruiser. And then you put him in these really sensitive roles where he's just a voice, and he's incredible.
Comedy sequence I did like, though, is the laxatives that Hogarth slips into Kent's ice cream, pretending it's just regular chocolate shavings, if you will. And Kent has to keep on going to the toilet even when he's investigating. That's a good
It's a nice little running gag.
And that's, of course, when Dean, Hogarth, and Iron Giant go out to the lake. They're doing that while Kent's been delayed investigating and can't find them. Also, it's an interesting touch when they find that the hunters have shot the deer, which, of course, it's the fall, it's deer season. They're allowed to do that. We can say it's immoral, but it's not like they're poaching. The Iron Giant's eyes briefly go red, even then. Of course, later on, when Hogarth pulls
sees the gun, right?
Yeah, because it sees the guns laying there, and it only very briefly happens. And it doesn't know. The Giant basically is like Bruce Banner with the Hulk.
Yeah, what happened?
It's unconscious.
Yeah.
It isn't in control of itself at all when this happens. It doesn't want to. And Hogarth teaches the Giant that souls don't die. Call back at the end of the movie, forgetting the fact that things rebuilding itself. If it wasn't, the soul's not dying is that they have the statue erected that Dean created, and everybody in the town is closer. Hogarth has all these friends he didn't have before, and then his soul, the Giant's soul, has not died because all these people realized they wouldn't be alive right now had the Giant not gone up there to save them. Except, of course, nothing would have happened in the first place. Had the Giant not gone off the coast of Maine and found all these people, they would have lived their lives just normally. He is the cause of and solution to all of Rockwell's problems.
A nice touch about this movie that does also make it a grown-up, more serious film than the average Disney film is it never explains where the Iron Giant came from and what his purpose actually was. It's not relevant. It would just muddy up the plot. It just lets us guess, or I don't know, just
could be also an homage to Transformers. It does transform.
They don't know where Transformers come from?
No, they do, but Transformers came from, I forget what it's even called, but their home planet, and they end up on Earth. And I forget why they came. There's probably been retcon versions of why they came. If somebody knows this better than me could explain it. But they end up here, and of course they transform. Well, this thing isn't the same as them, but it does transform into a gun. And to all these different things it can do. Look at the tentacle things that come out of its head, I guess. That's a reference to War of the Worlds. Those are the same things you see in War of the Worlds. And the fact it's got so many options with what it could do to blow things away. It eradicates tanks, which is a scene that you see in...
We never see anybody in those tanks. Presumably people die.
Well, that might be an homage to Day the Earth Stood Still, though, too, because Gort points its gun at a tank and all the guys get out, and then it shoots the tank, which just eradicates. There's nothing left of it. A similar thing is done in this movie, which is probably an homage to that.
It is a kid's movie, so they have to make sure that he doesn't actually kill anybody, because that would be a tougher pill for kids to swallow.
Well, in fact, when everyone finally sees him, except for Dean and Hogarth, and I guess the pictures that Mansley's seen of the thing, it's when the Giant has left because it nearly killed Hogarth. Oh my God, how could I? It'd be crying if it could cry. But it sees that two kids are, falling from a height or something like that, some bell tower or whatever the hell it is. And the Giant runs in and saves them. Now, of course, we like to have our pushing our glasses back on our nose moment, which you did as much as I did here. Which is, it catches them not long before they would have landed on the ground and been badly hurt or even died. But landing on him and not having him have give maybe with his hand, they'd still be badly hurt or die.
You fall 5 stories onto pavement, or you fall 5 stories onto the Iron Giant's
Or 4.5
hand.
stories.
Yeah, whatever. You're dead either way. His hand's not soft. But...
Well, just like when he's got Hogarth in his hands and Dean's trying to stop the military from shooting because he's holding a kid. He doesn't know he can fly. He just finds out, well, they're both falling off a cliff, and then his feet just engage rockets, and they go up in the air, and he can fly. He's Superman. But he's holding Hogarth through all that sequence, and they're shooting at him. They end up in the snow. He's cradling Hogarth, which is nice, but Hogarth would be bopping around inside there and would be badly hurt.
If Hogarth was in a car, even with a seatbelt on, that did what the Iron Giant did in that sequence, he would die in that car.
Yeah.
And there's no extra safety for him in the Giant. But again, what are you going to do? It is a cartoon after all, and you just have to give it some forgiveness. We should talk about the design of the Giant, which is part of the charm and the thoughtfulness and just the beauty of this film. This is a really beautiful film. One of the last classical animations, because it's not long after this that pretty much across the board everything became 3D.
Not 3D, but digital animation, CGI. This is a hand-drawn movie, except the Giant. The Giant is CGI.
Yeah, the Giant is 3D animated, but they painted over every cell, hand-drawn, so that it would match everything else. So everything else has that very classical feel, but he feels like he comes from the future in a way, which is a beautiful part of its design, although they still animated him on the 2s. Typically with digital, it's animated with every frame. I guess that would be on the 1s? I don't know. I'm trying to sound smart over here. We talked about that a lot when we covered Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, because they played with that a lot.
Oh, yeah. All kinds of different types of animation are in that.
Just the look of him. It's both retro and futuristic. It certainly is inspired by Transformers, as you say, but then also War of the Worlds, The Day the Earth Stood Still. There's all these different components that make it retro and futuristic at the same time. But more than anything, they managed to give him a face that is expressive without
It's reasonably
being
expressive.
mobile. The design of his eyes with the rotating eyelids allow him to have expressions. The luminosity of his eyes
The
will
giant
change.
is heartbroken when he sees the dead deer.
Yes, and
really
you can
sells that.
tell, even though he doesn't have eyebrows to furrow. But it's so beautifully expressive. The design of it is amazing. And his body language, of course, because even though he's presumably from another planet, and his body language perfectly mimics human body language.
Of course, naturally.
Yeah, I won't push my glasses up on that. That's
As much as I love the cannonball moment and then the tidal wave that comes from that, it's also cute. I think it's earlier on in the movie. It must be when the giant and Hogarth are first getting to know each other, and it starts to sit back, but it takes forever to land, and then when it does, everything rocks.
crash, yeah.
That just shows you how powerful and heavy this thing is. That it's not trying to cause problems, and it still is. The same with the cannonball thing. It's trying to have fun, but the water's gone from the lake when it does that.
Yeah, he mirrors everything Hogarth does because he loves him. Right from the moment Hogarth saves him, he imprints onto him. He's his friend, but more than that, he's like his guide in this world. So
That's
he
right.
does everything he does.
Giant could have destroyed itself with its own hubris really early on because it's at the power plant and bites it and electrocutes itself, and only because of Hogarth does it not just keep on being electrocuted. I guess eventually it would short out the system and maybe the whole town would have no power for a little while. But it's Hogarth that throws the switch that stops it. And in fact, the giant brings the switch to show, I guess the indication being, I realize you saved me, thank you. And then the friendship is born. So I've talked about most of the cast members, but also James Gammon, the manager from the Major League movies. Forget about the curveball, Ricky. Give him the heater. He's got two roles in this. He's the foreman, Marv Loach, and he's Floyd Turbo. John Mahoney, we've covered quite a few times. He's in Moonstruck. Reality Bite, according to my notes, Reality Bites, we just covered that recently. He's also the manager in 8 Men Out, which Chris and I covered on Scoring at the Movies, the old sports movie podcast I did stop doing, I guess, a year ago. And, of course, he's the dad in Frasier. And then two people have very small roles in this, but they've been in tons of movies we've covered, and they're, I don't know about legends, but certainly well-known if you're any kind of movie fan. M. Emmett Walsh has a voice in this briefly. He was in Serpico. He was in Blade Runner, of course. He's the one that hires Harrison Ford's character. He's got a small role in Midnight Cowboy. He's in Slapshot, which Chris and I covered on Scoring at the Movies. But then the teacher, who has maybe 2 lines, and it might only be 1 line, Cloris Leachman, Butch Cassidy, Last Picture Show, Bad Santa, Fix You Some Sandwiches. She's in the Longest Yard remake, which Chris and I covered on Scoring at the Movies, and she's a legend on TV. I think she has not the most ever Emmys for an actress. That's, I think, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, but she's on the list of some of the most Emmys of all time. But they cut her part almost entirely out. So it's mostly Jennifer Aniston for the females in this movie when it comes to voice work. The director, Brad Bird, this was his debut as a filmmaker. He won Oscars for Best Animated Feature for The Incredibles and Ratatouille. You like The Incredibles, right? I know you don't like Ratatouille, but you like The Incredibles?
I do like The
Right.
Incredibles, yeah.
The sequel I've been meaning to watch for the longest time. If I've seen it a second time, then I don't remember it, but I know I like it. I just didn't like it as much as the first one. And he's also the director of, well, Tomorrowland, but that's not good. But Mission Impossible 4, Ghost Protocol, which I like as a movie, but of course, my favorite sequence, maybe one of my favorites ever, and certainly of that decade, I think, would be when Tom Cruise climbs the Burj Khalifa and nearly falls off of it in Brad Bird's Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. This movie was partly inspired by, actually, a real-life thing. It's pretty sad. Apparently, Bird's sister was killed by a gun, and he wondered, what if a gun had a soul?
Oh.
Could it shoot somebody? And I guess you could say, if,
right. Oh, yeah, I
if a
remember.
handgun had a soul, how would it stop somebody from pulling the trigger? But that was his thinking.
She was murdered by her ex-husband.
Oh, God. I didn't
I
hear
know,
that part.
total tragedy.
Okay. So he co-wrote with Tim, I guess McKinley, is how you say the name, who worked on Smallville and some other things. But Bird, of course, is known for the Pixar stuff since this. And I think before was on their creative team, but definitely was a Simpsons guy as well.
I have a quick note about the Simpsons thing. The studio gave him all these notes of what they wanted him to do because they wanted to make it like every other animated film. And one of the things they wanted was for them to add a goofy dog sidekick. Hogarth had a pet, and that would just cause all kinds of hijinks. It made me think about how Bird must have been having flashbacks to the Poochie episode of The Simpsons, which I looked up, and it was in like 96, I think that aired.
And he was there when that
I
happened?
don't know if he was there, but I'm sure that he would have seen it and been aware of it.
He probably was around that time.
Yeah, they also wanted it to be set in present day instead of the 50s, and they wanted it to have a hip-hop soundtrack.
Well, the jazz is because of Dean, because he's into jazz. He's a hippie, beatnik type character. Not a hippie, I guess, in the 50s.
But the score is
Beatnik.
chiefly of traditional film
Yeah, right,
score. It's
okay.
not really very
Okay.
jazzy. It has its jazzy moments for Dean, but in general, it's a pretty traditional soundtrack.
And Hogarth can't have a dog because he needs to have this as his pet and his friend and his father figure and his kid and all these other things that it actually is. And then what's the other thing you said? Oh, the modern era. It can't be the modern era because the whole point is that people are paranoid about the Russians, Sputnik, all the rest of that.
And also setting this film in the 50s is part of what helps make it a truly timeless film. Whenever you have a modern film that's set in a period, then it stops it from looking dated years from now. It doesn't look dated at all.
No. Alison Abate, or Abate, I guess maybe is how you say her name, and Des McAnuff are the producers on this. She made a lot of cartoons. In fact, her resume is mostly animated films, and he went on to direct. I also read something about how she, Allison, and Bird really battled on this. I guess maybe Bird won. I don't know if Bird's hard to work with. I'm not saying that. But she worked with a lot of other animated filmmakers, and I didn't read that. Maybe she, I don't know. Sometimes people just don't gel, and it's no one person's fault. I already said the movie's 239 to 1. We saw it on our DVD, so avoid that wrong aspect ratio if you care about that on maybe some other streaming service, if you don't have Crave like we do in Canada. The cinematographer, and of course that's a fairly new thing with animation to actually have a cinematographer credit, but this one does, Steven Wilsbach. It was his only cinematographer credit. He was a camera operator for 15 years, or maybe still is. Well, I guess 15 years he can't still be. Anyway, that's what I have down here. The editor, Darren Holmes, also cut Ratatouille, so worked with Bird again, and he worked on the 1994 Lion King. Maybe a re-release. I didn't look that closely at that, but in some way or another he worked on Lion King as an editor. And the composer, Michael Kamen, not a name people talk about enough, because he did the music for Robin Hood, meaning the Costner one, The Dead Zone, which we've covered, and the Lethal Weapon scores, so that famous saxophone solo you get in those movies. He was nominated for 2 songs, not from those movies, or maybe Robin Hood. Maybe he was, I think he actually co-wrote the Bryan Adams song. But the thing about him that I always think stands out the most is he's written good scores, definitely, and this is a good one too, is that when you get a, was it Morgan's Creek DVD from the old days? That da 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 that plays in the opening with their logo. That's from Robin Hood. He wrote that music.
Oh.
So just like when you get a Warner Brothers movie and you hear the As Time Goes By music, that's of course a play on Casablanca. And then Pinocchio, When You Wish Upon a Star, is before Disney movies. Well, Michael Kamen's responsible for the Morgan's Creek logo, and that may be a defunct studio now or production company, but they were a big production company for a long time, and it was his music from a very good movie. I love Robin Hood, actually, 1991, and I love that score. What happens next? Well, we see it already. The robot rebuilt itself and lives the rest of its life in Hogarth's closet, just like E.T. would have spent the rest of his life in Elliot's closet if living on Earth wasn't killing him, and if it wasn't for that meddling government. That's not going to happen, but that's what happens next.
The atom bomb leaves him somewhat brain dead, and then he can truly become a pet. It starts off with a bump of the head. We didn't say it's the bump of the head that stops him from understanding what his true purpose is when he crash lands on Earth. And then it gets popped out when he turns into a weapon at the end of the film. But maybe a nuke blasts him so completely to oblivion that he's lobotomized.
Or it could end up being like the, what's it called again, Homelander in The Boys, who is a-hole Superman, is really what that whole concept is.
Yeah, maybe it'll turn him into a total raging monster, and they should have destroyed him when they had the chance.
Yeah. All right, then, our last movie of July, The Iron Giant, your last thoughts.
Well, 25 years later, this is really a timeless classic. It proves that story is king, and it proves that you don't have to insult the intelligence of your audience, even if they're kids. It gives kids credit for being able to get invested in a story without all the bells and whistles that usually come with kids' movies. No musical numbers, no goofy dog sidekicks, and that you don't need to have context for every little thing that they add in the film. This is probably the way a lot of kids learned about the Cold War and Sputnik, and that's okay. Kids figure stuff out. They're used to watching things without context. You can just treat them like adults and they'll get it.
Even entertainment can teach them something.
Yeah.
It's a shame that it failed when it came out because it deserved so much better. It's a lovely, touching movie. Made you cry. It has made me cry before. The voice actors do a wonderful job. The animation is excellent. And the story, unfortunately, remains relevant because the whole concept, you don't have to be a gun. Well, no one is a gun, but look how big guns still are in the whole world, but especially in America. And people like Brad Bird's sister get killed by them every day. I don't like it quite as much as Bird's Pixar movies, especially The Incredibles, or the best parts of Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol, the Burj Khalifa, but it's very close. It remains only perhaps his best film. I said that last week, that it was perhaps his best film. You probably think it is.
It's my favorite Brad Bird film. It's not even close, really.
Except for Tomorrowland. I like everything he's made as a director. I like it a lot, too. I don't know if it's the best, but it's certainly on the short list. He does a short list. He hasn't made that many movies, but he's a great filmmaker. And Ratatouille is better than you think it is. So that was how we saw The Iron Giant. And since this is our last episode of July, that means our next show will air on the civic holiday here in Ontario. I don't think it's all of Canada, but at least in Ontario. Simcoe Day, civic holiday, whatever. Since our listicle on Canada Day, our top 10 underrated directors, or their movies that are underrated of those 10 directors we chose. So since that listicle did great for us, let's do another one on the civic holiday. We'll be giving you our hot takes about certain filmmakers and things about the movie business. Maybe a director, maybe a writer, maybe a producer, maybe a movie theater thing. I don't know. Basically, it almost could be another play on the underrated thing, the underdog take that maybe not everyone agrees with, that Bev has or I have. I guess we'll both pick 5 again, so a top 10, if you will. So that's what it's going to be, a listicle of things that we think about a movie or about a person that makes movies or something.
The industry.
That not everyone thinks, that maybe not very many people think, in fact. And since there's no coming attractions trivia for our listicle, Bev, just tell them all about us.
All right, so you already know how to find us, but let me remind you to favorite or subscribe wherever you listen, which is also where you can find our archive of over 600 episodes that are available for free.
602.
That's right. And while you're there, please, in return for all of this excellent free content, all we ask of you is to leave a rating and a review. It's a great way to support the podcast. You can find us both on Twitter. I'm at Bev Ellis Ellis, and Ryan is at MovieFiend51. You can also reach us by email, haveyouvrseenpodcast@gmail.com, and you can find us on YouTube. Our channel is at HYES Ellis. And to enjoy freshly roasted premium coffee delivered straight to you in Canada or the US, please go to sparkplug.coffee/HYES and enjoy a 20% discount.
We need to go off the air now. No following.
And cut.
Super bad.